Let's go ahead and get started. Uh, our topic for today: management of escalation, aka crisis intervention, prevention, and planning. Um, our map to understanding patterns, pitfalls, and opportunities in working with children, adults, and families. Our objectives for this training is one, we want to recognize and describe three different species of crisis. We want to understand the cyclical nature of crisis situations that are related to the need for different coping skills. And then lastly, we want to be able to conduct a risk assessment and basic safety plan that is specific and relevant to the persons served. But before we do that, let's define what a crisis is. And so we got four different definitions here of what a crisis is. But I'd like you to take a moment in the chat and just take a moment to identify which one of these definitions resonates the most with you. You know, when you think about and internalize what a crisis means to you, which one of these definitions, screams out the loudest to you? Definition number one: a stage in a sequence of events at which the trend of all future events, for better or worse, is determined, a turning point. Three, a dramatic, emotional, or circumstantial upheaval in a person's life. Okay. Listen, I'm with you. That's usually my go-to as well, simply because when I think about a dramatic, emotional, or circumstantial upheaval in a person's life, it's a definition that I think makes it quite difficult for any of us to say we've never been in a crisis or had a crisis experience, right? Um, because one person's crisis may not be another person's crisis. Um, with the first definition, a stage in a sequence of events at which the trend of all future events, for better or worse, is determined, a turning point. I like that because, it kind of gives you that prospect that, things could get better. They don't have to get worse, right? So, although I'm experiencing what feels like a crisis, I can, move forward in a better or improved direction despite how I might feel in the moment. Two, okay, I heard that. So, a condition of instability or danger, as in social, economic, political, international affairs, leading to a decisive change. Um, I like that definition as well. I mean, all of these definitions are appropriate. When I think about definition number two, we can kind of liken it to the situations with our families, right? When a child goes into care, when we think about definition number two, a condition of instability or danger, as in social, economic, political, or international affairs leading to a decisive change, I think about our foster children that come into care and their families, right? They are certainly experiencing a crisis type situation. And, in many cases, it is the result of there being some instability or danger. Um, and sometimes those dangers or instabilities can vary as to why. In many cases, it may be social or economic, specifically on that level. But if we think about it on a larger level, just thinking about COVID, right? A couple of years back, definitely a time of instability, a time of danger where countries were shutting down their borders and limiting travel in and out of the country. We all, had to go through and experience the shutdowns, limiting traffic and where we could travel, when we could travel. Had to deal with there being shortages in supplies because companies, factories, businesses weren't producing products with the same frequency that they were prior to the pandemic. But that didn't stop us having certain needs. We still needed food. We still needed different toiletries and stuff like that. And so with those demands remaining the same, but supplies kind of going down, it was definitely a time of instability. And then lastly, definition number four, which is more of a medical definition: the point in the course of a serious disease at which a decisive change occurs, leading either to recovery or to death. And well, quite obviously, we would want to move in the direction of recovery. But again, going back to COVID, and having to deal with the medical side of that, not everybody was fortunate enough to, come out and recover from being exposed to COVID. Many people did lose their life when battling against COVID. And the same is true with many other types of ailments, right? If we look at that medically from a mental health standpoint, you may not be physically losing your life if you are not able to reach a place of recovery when it comes to mental health. But you very well may, in many ways, feel like you have lost your life, or the normalcy of life when battling mental health challenges, because you're moving along and not able to necessarily, in some instances, do things the way you normally would, or with the ease that you normally would. Now, the three different types of crises that we want to talk about are situational, developmental, and systemic. And these crises are sorted by predictability. So, in other words, a crisis that is situational is going to be the least predictable of these three, while systemic crises is going to be the most predictable of the three. And so, developmental then falls right in the middle. So, let's talk real quickly about what each of these are. So, a situational crisis is one that is generally unforeseen, thought to be senseless or random, and is a surprise, right? It's unexpected. Now, although we know we can experience things like automobile accidents, falling ill, fires, and other events characterized by loss, although we know we can face those challenges, we oftentimes hope that they don't occur, but we certainly don't know up front ahead of time when they'll occur, right? We just know that there's the possibility that these things can occur. So when you think about an automobile accident, for example, what are some things with that type of situational crisis that we can do to either minimize the likelihood that we end up in an accident, or if we do end up in an accident, reduce the adverse or negative effects of that accident?
The speed limit.
Okay, so obey the speed limit, and for that matter, any other laws of the road, right? So obeying the speed limit and following the laws of the road will help us reduce our risk of being in an accident. Anything else?
Having smoke detectors and things in your house, fire extinguisher.
So that would be great for fire. But what about an automobile accident? We're focused on that one. That's all right. We're focused on that one for right now.
Bring your cell phone down.
All right. So not having distractions, right? Cell phones being one of them. So if we minimize distractions while we're driving, we reduce the chances that we end up in an accident. Anything else? What about some things that help to, well, you know what? Driving the speed limit and following the laws, not having distractions, those also not only reduce the risk of us, the chances of us getting in an accident, they can also help reduce the damage or the impact of an accident if we are in one, right? Because obviously the slower you're driving, the less impactful that collision can be, kind of reducing injury and stuff like that. Anything else we might do or have in place to help, make it easier to navigate that experience if we were in an accident?
Seatbelts, yeah.
Wear our seatbelts, right? Absolutely. And if we think about it going a step further, many vehicles nowadays have airbags and all kinds of safety features in them. But we also have insurance, right? And having insurance helps us to reduce the financial strain of an accident if we're in one, because paying somewhere from $250, $500, or $1,000 for a deductible is a lot more manageable than trying to have to pay tens of thousands of dollars in damages if something were to occur. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? Developmental crises, again, are a little bit more predictable, right? Because these are considered to be linked to change points in our life cycle. So when we think about things like adolescence, adulthood, our first job, marriage, these are some examples of developmental crises that we can plan for. So that's a big part of a developmental crisis because it's linked to these change points in our lives. We have a greater opportunity to plan for them. So when you think about it, the example of having children, right? What are some ways in which we might prepare for having children so that it doesn't feel so much like a crisis when we do have children?
Can you repeat the question?
When we think about having children, right? Preparation so that we don't feel like a crisis, so that it doesn't feel like a crisis when we have a child or have children. What are some things that we might do to prepare ourselves for that life event, that change point in our life cycle?
Saving money.
We might save some money, okay? And why, when it comes to a child, why would we want to have money saved up?
They're expensive.
She said, because they're expensive. Yes, children are expensive. So, what are some of those expenses that we anticipate having with children?
You need something for them to sleep in, clothes, food.
Okay, so we got to clothe them, we got to feed them, we've got to shelter them, right? If we're thinking long term, we're thinking about things like school and educate, so education, and that's at this day and age, that's not just considering college, right? We may have to consider where we want them to go to school for grade school, middle school, and in some instances that may come at a cost. All right. Um, but nonetheless, when we, prepare for these things, so we, preparing to have, solid shelter, housing, we understand that those are necessities when it comes to not just for us, but for raising children. It's that much more of a necessity, another additional mouth to feed, right? And so the more time or the more we put into preparing for that, uh, the easier it is to handle that. Now, there's some things that we just can't prepare for. You just kind of are learning as you go when we consider parenthood. But you get the point. These developmental crises, we have an opportunity to plan ahead because we can anticipate, when that might happen. So, for example, when it comes to having children, I know that I've got to be sexually active. I have to have reached the, stage of puberty where I can procreate and have children. So if I know that neither one of those things are present, I know that there's less of a risk of me becoming a parent. Now, we can throw in the caveat of foster care and adoption and things of that nature, which can also increase our chances of, becoming a parent. God forbid a loved one, passes away and we have to care for a relative, right? But depending on the circumstances around that, that is likely going to be more of a situational crisis, right? Rather than a developmental crisis. But if we think about having children just under, what we normally think about when it comes to having children, we can plan for it. Um, Lastly, our systemic crisis. So when we encounter situational and developmental crises, and we fail to develop effective coping skills and build resilience from those crisis events, we may eventually find ourselves in a state of systemic crisis, right? So, just thinking about our example of situational crisis of a automobile accident. If I find myself being in an automobile accident because I was distracted or not, obeying the laws governing the road, um, if I don't make any adjustments and correct those behaviors, I'm probably going to end up in another accident, right?
Uh-huh.
And if I continue to fail to make corrections, I'm gonna become a repeat offender. And every time you turn around, you're gonna hear me talking about the last accident that I was in. That's becoming a systemic issue, because if I do that frequently enough, what do you think happens to my insurance?
When I say you no longer have insurance, you walk into the same thing over and over again.
Right? If I get in enough accidents, the insurance company is going to be like, you know what, you're too much of a risk. We no longer want to insure you, right? Or the cost becomes so much that I can't even afford to drive anymore. So, systemic crises are situations that are systemic in nature and have to do with, again, coping skill sets and support systems that are either limited or not sustainable with regard to dealing with stressors, right? So, when we think about some of the examples listed here, like a domestic violence, depression, addiction, diabetes, heart disease, we don't go to bed one day and wake up the next day in these circumstances, right? These are circumstances that occur over time, right? And it's the result of continual decisions and choices that we make that land us in that space, right? And so likewise, when we think about, again, these situational and developmental uh, crises, we definitely want to view them as opportunities to grow and build effective coping skills, opportunities to grow and build effective support systems. Just kind of looking back on the conversation about having children, right? Some people may plan well when it comes to having housing, having the finances that they need to care for their child and all of that good stuff. But if they fail to have a support system, what happens one day when all of a sudden, my child falls ill and, I don't have that support system to kind of pitch in and help me maybe transport my child to and from school or daycare or what have you. It's up to me to get that all done, which makes that a lot more difficult. And so not having that support system could add extra strain on that situation, making it a little bit more difficult for me to handle. And, God forbid, I have a child that has like a chronic medical condition. I'm gonna miss a ton of time, right? And that might be problematic with my employer. But if I have a support system, I have a village, I have a group of individuals that can pitch in and help me out, it makes that a lot more manageable, right? And so for some individuals who have large families, that might be pretty easy for them to do, especially if the family is really tight and really supportive of one another. But it could be the opposite. I could have a big family, but maybe we are not closely connected and, not supportive of one another. Or, I have a really small family, so I don't have access to that. I have to build an extended family. I have to build an extended support system with friends. Now, one of the ways we can begin to look at the cyclical nature of a crisis cycle is through basic economic theory, right? Things that we typically may experience as situational and seemingly random events, when we start to look at them as a cycle, we start to see that there's like this repetition, right? These ebbs and flows of those events. And if you just look at kind of, consider the gas price, for example, right? Gas prices are constantly on, they're rising, falling, rising, falling. Now, ultimately, they're steadily rising, but we can see these ebbs and flows, right? Because, I think, what's the gas price today? $3.29, right?
Yeah, $3.29.
She said, I need that gas station.
Regular? It must be regular. Yeah, it's regular. Okay.
So $3.29, whereas about a week ago, gas prices was, kind of around that $3.40, maybe even $3.50 range, right? And, of course, it varies from location to location, but long story short, we see those ebbs and flows, those rise and falls of the gas prices. And so similar, when we think about a systemic crisis, we're going to see those ebbs and flows, those highs and lows, where, you know, we find ourselves in a slump, we get a little escalated, end up in the boom. If we aren't able to regulate ourselves, we end up in a full out crisis. Right now, fortunately, crises don't have to last forever. Some last longer than others, but we eventually come out of that crisis and we're back into the slump, right? And we end up on this roller coaster, if you will. Right? From an outside view, we start off our crisis viewing or looking at our baseline coping skills, where we are making note of or observing those things that work most of the time, right? And so those things that work most of the time, if they are in fact effective, they keep us from moving along in this crisis cycle onto the tension building stage. But if they don't work, we end up in that tension building stage where we have to navigate this world of internal and external triggers, events where, you know, our usual coping skills are ineffective, or we alienate our support system, right? So when we do those things, we continue to move in this crisis cycle through the tension building stage onto an outright crisis event, right? Where outside systems are involved, and needed to help provide relief or to help repair supports that might not have been utilized or that might have been ineffective, right? And so our goal is to get back to that baseline, our baseline coping skills, back to a place where we're stable and can hopefully have better outcomes if we're faced with said crisis again. The last part of our crisis cycle is that recovery phase, right? And this is where we either are identifying and developing new skills, or maybe even identifying new resources. Okay. So now that we know that the crisis can be cyclical, so the plan to deal with it should be to what, right? So we got this mitigation and prevention stage, preparedness, response, recovery. What are we doing in each part of this crisis? Let's talk about it. All right. So from a planning standpoint, where we're considering our resources, goals, and roles, we want to rehearse new skills in the mitigation and prevention stage. So that earliest part of the crisis cycle, those skills that we have identified or those new skills that we've identified, we want to rehearse those skills. We want to use those skills. When and if they are effective, we can head off a crisis and prevent ourselves from moving into that preparedness stage or that tension building stage. But if we find ourselves in the preparedness stage, the tension building stage, now we have that moment where we have to ready and rally resources. Okay. And so, you know, resources in short can be people, places, or things, right? You know, some people may decide as a resource they're going to go to the gym, go for a walk, go for a run, work out. Some people may engage in the arts, right? So maybe playing music or drawing or what, like tons of different things that we can do based on who we are as an individual that can help to stabilize us, calm us, or soothe us. And again, that varies from person to person, right? For some, it may be calling their friend, calling a family member, and talking to them to kind of vent and unload. But whatever the resource is, that preparedness stage is that opportunity for us to tap into those. When those resources are unavailable or fail us, we will ultimately find ourselves in the response stage or the peak of the crisis situation. And more often than not, here's where we just simply need to ride out the storm. Because if you just consider yourselves and think about any time that you've been worked up, were you in the mood to talk?
No.
Not at all, right? When we're escalated and really excited, and not good excited, but like emotionally excited, upset, angry, we're rarely in a position to talk. because we're not necessarily thinking clearly. Those are times where we may say some things that we want to take back because we're saying them from an emotional place. And unfortunately, there are things that we may genuinely feel, but we might have a better or different way of communicating those and expressing how we feel so that they're not necessarily hurtful or damaging to others. Or better yet, we might, after thinking about it, realize, okay, I feel this way, but should I really be feeling this way? Let me reconsider that. Let me get a better understanding as to why I might feel that way, right? So for those of us who are in a position to help that person though during that time, we may have to like really commit to saying, you know what, let's just ride this thing out, give them a moment, give them some time, the same way we would want time if we were in that situation. Uh, Hopefully, we can get out of that response stage as quickly as possible and transition into the recovery phase, where we can then rest and reassess. All right. So that recovery period, that's our opportunity to look back at the entire cycle and kind of say to ourselves, where did we miss the mark? Now, obviously, if we're in the recovery phase, one could argue we missed the mark all the way through. But what we want to take a look at is specifically, how did we miss the mark in each of these phases? What specifically went wrong in each phase to get us into a full out crisis and having to go through this recovery process? Now, timing interventions in the cycle. All right, so let's look at the 4 R's. And when we look at receptivity, the helper has the greatest leverage at the phase of the crisis event. This is often the time when people seek help, yet the most effective time to intervene is either prior to or after the crisis. So when you think about receptivity, it's really looking at this through the lens of the person in crisis, right? Are they receptive to the interventions that have been identified? If they are, they're going to utilize those interventions and they're going to help themselves avoid a crisis, right? Because they're thinking about them the moment that they find themselves kind of feeling a little off base. Likewise, let's say, they're maybe caught by surprise and they find themselves moving past that first phase of the crisis and now are, full-fledged in the preparedness stage. Well, they still have an opportunity to avoid a crisis at that point. The question is, are they receptive enough to exercise or reach out to and utilize the resources that have been identified for them? If they are, they're going to do that. Reactivity and resistance. This is where we're going to shift gears a little bit and kind of look at the person who is in a position to help, right? And so your helper during the tension building phase, that's when they're going to be most likely to be reactive if they're not responding effectively to the crisis situation. Because if you just think about it, tension has been built, right? So that person who is going through the crisis, they're not the only one at risk of experiencing that tension. The helper can also experience tension during that time. And if that tension that the helper experiences is not managed properly, they're going to potentially become reactive and catastrophize the situation. Now, there's ways in which we can be reactive, and it's crystal clear that we're being reactive and catastrophizing the situation. But then there's more subtle ways that we can do it too, and not realize that we are being reactive and catastrophizing the situation. So, for example, just think about, a typical interaction with a parent and child, right? Parent tells a child to go upstairs and clean their room or whatever, right? And the child proceeds to go upstairs to clean their room, but as they're proceeding in that direction, they're stumping up the steps, mumbling under their breath, and they ultimately slam the door when they get in their room. It's not unexpected or uncommon for a parent in that moment to call the child back downstairs. Why? Because they want to address the stomping up the steps. They want to address the, talking back or mumbling under their breath. or they want to address the slamming of the door. But that could very well be catastrophizing and being reactive in that moment, because the instruction that was given was to go to their room and clean their room. So in that instance, I might be better off giving them a moment, giving them an opportunity to clean their room, because they were partially compliant. And what I mean by that, they went to their room, right? So they proceeded in the direction of kind of doing what it is that I've told them to do, regardless of what I think they're going to do when they get in their room, right? So the fact that they went in their room, I'm going to think positively and give them an opportunity to first and foremost clean their room. Whereas if I call them back to address the attitude, the stomping up the steps, the slamming the door, I very well may be playing right into their hand, because they don't want to clean their room. That's why they gave the attitude, right? So now I'm either delaying that or kind of, getting them out of it altogether, because I've shifted my focus. I've allowed myself to be reactive. Now, resistance, on the other hand, this is going to be more likely seen in the helper during the recovery phase. And this is where we are, kind of inclined to engage in minimization. So, I've gone through the crisis situation with the person, but specifically we're looking at this through the lens of, I've gone through a crisis, or I've dealt with a child who has gone through a crisis rather, and we've gone through the entire crisis cycle. We're now in the recovery phase. Well, this is the period in which I'm supposed to be working with that child to look back on the crisis and reflect on where we went wrong. Were the coping skills that we've identified not effective? Right? Were the resources not available? But if I don't do that, and instead, I become dismissive, or, kind of nonchalant, i.e., I'm acting as if, what, it's okay. It doesn't, it's all right. So if I brush it off and fail to take that opportunity during the recovery phase to reflect on the crisis cycle, I'm minimizing. I'm becoming resistant. And I may be doing that because internally I don't want to do the work of going through the recovery phase. Or perhaps maybe I'm looking at it, and I've had so many encounters with this, because we're talking about a cyclical, we're talking about a systemic crisis at this point. It's happened so many times, I may have lost hope, and I may start to believe that, this isn't going to get better. And so I may internalize and think that the easiest way for me to handle it at this point is to become resistant and to minimize. But that's ultimately not going to be helpful. All right. Lastly is recovery and reset, right? We want to reach a place of recovery where we've identified skills and resources that can help us minimize the reoccurrence of said crisis and eventually avoid that crisis altogether. But likewise, unfortunately, there are times where we may have to hit the reset button, right? And so we've got to revisit things and say, all right, maybe we need to make some adjustments. And hopefully in making those corrections, we'll have better outcomes the next go around. A crisis plan should be based on risk assessment, right? So risk is equal to probability times severity. When we think about the term probability, in short, that is simply, talking about the likelihood of something happening, right? Whereas severity is going to talk to us more about how bad it can get, or the intensity, if you will, right? And so just looking at it through a simple mathematical equation or lens, the likelihood of something happening times how bad it can get begins to give us a sense of the level of risk that we're dealing with, right? So if you just think about when you go to the doctors, right, or you go to the ER to get treated for, pain that you might be experiencing. A couple of questions that the doctors are going to ask you, or the nurses are going to ask you right offhand, is how long have you been feeling this way, right? When was the last time you felt this way? How often are you feeling this way, or experiencing these pains, right? Um, on a scale of 1 to 10, how harsh is the pain, right? These are just some general basic questions that the doctors and medical professionals are going to ask, because they're trying to get a sense of probability and severity. They're trying to assess the risk. Now, there's many reasons that they're doing that. Some is to determine who gets treated first, but in short, is really also determining how they're going to treat or respond to uh, that specific crisis situation, right? They may even ask us things about our family history, whatever it is that we're experiencing, right? Again, to maybe get a better understanding of probability, as well as how bad this situation can become. Uh, when we further begin to assess risk, we can kind of, look at these three questions here. And while they're not going to predict behavior 100% of the time, they will help us begin to focus our efforts and plans as we prepare to respond to that crisis. So the question of what's the most dangerous thing the individual's ever done, again, that's going back to that severity. That's going to let us know how bad the situation could potentially get. What happened right after that? How did those who were in a position to help respond? Going back to that conversation around whether or not we're being resistant or reactive, right, in the various parts of the crisis cycle. And then lastly, how did they feel about it? Right? That's talking about, how did the person who experienced the crisis, how did they feel about that crisis? Right? Did their feelings, did they experience feelings that would cause them to want to make changes so that they don't experience that crisis again? Or did they experience feelings that made them feel good and potentially would invite them to uh, engage in that said crisis again? Right? How a person feels as after a crisis event may very well impact whether or not that crisis event becomes a reoccurring. All right, so real quickly, looking at the risk assessment process, and beginning to plan. Um, as we assess the risk, we want to consider the behavior, right? So we want to look at the action, but we also want to look at the intentions behind the action. So we want to have a sense of why the crisis is occurring. All right, so again, as we begin to further assess risk, we want to identify the action, but we additionally want to also identify the intention, right? And so off to the left here, we have a list of different actions. And so just to complete a quick exercise, what I'd like you to do is, for anyone, all of you, read the behaviors listed off to the left, and someone give me one of those behaviors for us to complete a quick exercise with.
Self-injury.
All right, so self-injury is the behavior that we're going to complete this exercise with. Now what I want you to do is, I want each of you to kind of look at the list of examples on the right, and I want you all to identify the first thing on that list that comes to mind as to why you think the person is engaging in self-injurious behavior. All right, so the person is engaging in self-injurious behavior. Which one of those examples do you think is the cause for them doing so?
Trauma reattachment.
All right, so we got one for trauma reenactment. What else?
Discharge of pent-up emotions.
Discharge of pent-up emotions. Good. Anybody see anything else? Oh, rallying family and friends. That's the one you're talking about? Okay.
I'm gonna say trauma reenactment.
Somebody said that one. So two of you said that one? So I heard trauma reenactment, discharge of pent-up emotions, and rallying friends and family. So here's the reality, right? we could have answered any one of those examples as being the cause for self-injurious behavior, right? And some of them may be a little bit harder than others to kind of make that connection, but like any of them genuinely could be the cause for that self-injurious behavior. The reason it's important to identify which one it is because if I address the wrong intention, is that going to be effective when it comes to responding to the crisis?
No.
Not at all, right? Because someone who is doing it to rally friends, for example, if you think about a child in foster care injuring themselves, thinking that that's going to get them home quicker or get more attention from their parents. Specifically, if you think about a child who's in foster care and let's say their parent has missed, visits, right? That child could potentially think, well, if I injure myself, my parent will definitely show up. But if I think that that's the issue and the reason why they're engaging in the self-injurious behavior, my plan should be effective. But if I think that it's something else, like let's say sense of control, right? So if I think that they're injuring themselves to try to have some sense of control because maybe they feel like they don't have control in other areas, and I try to address it that way, they're not going to effectively respond to whatever that plan is, because that's not the reason that they're doing that's not the reason that they're injuring themselves. Okay. So just as much as we want to identify the behavior, we want to maybe even more narrow down what the cause or the intention behind that behavior is, right? Because that's going to begin to dictate what our plan looks like. All right, so crisis planning for community-based treatment. Some best practices. We want to focus on what the client and family does well. We want to develop it in collaboration with the client and family, right? Because guess what? If the client and family doesn't agree with the plan, you think they're going to follow it? Not at all, right? It should promote the use of least restrictive interventions. Thus, when we're creating plans, we want to create them with the environment that they're going to be utilized in mind, right? So if I'm creating a plan for the home environment, I'm not going to create a plan that has the school necessarily in mind, right? Because that's a different environment, different guidelines, rules, and things like that are in place, and vice versa, right? If it's meant for school, I'm not going to create a plan that is better suited for home, because that would make that, in either one of those situations, that plan becomes a lot more restrictive. It should contain specific action steps that can be taken, as well as local resources that can be used to prevent a crisis and to improve coping during crisis situations. Right? It needs to be clear, right? The clearer, the better. If we don't have those clear action steps that can kind of guide people on what they should do in response, it can become a little bit complicated, right? Because now I'm left to guess and figure out what I should be doing rather than knowing kind of clearly what I should be doing each step of the way. Lastly, explicit roles of team members, boundaries, and role limitations should be discussed in order to identify the individual most equipped to handle the crisis situation. So, just kind of considering yourselves as foster parents, you interact with a lot of different professionals as it relates to the children in your care. It's pretty important to know who is responsible for what, or what the various roles of each individual is, because you may find in some instances that some individuals really aren't in a position to help you at all, depending on the nature of crisis, right? Where others might. And so knowing what their roles are will kind of help guide your conversation when you're reaching out to certain individuals, and better yet, streamline uh, and help you to, more effectively respond to a crisis, as well as gain better access to resources that may be needed when responding to a crisis. Okay. Collaborative construction of the crisis / safety plan. One, it should be based on solid risk assessment. Two, it should start with a conversation that focuses on responding, resiliency, and resources. How are those connected to the crisis? Responding to said crisis. Resiliency, right? Specifically, how is the person who is experiencing the crisis, how are they bouncing back from the crisis when it occurs? But two, how are those who are in a position to help? What does their resiliency look like? How are they bouncing back, right? Once we've gone through the crisis cycle. And then lastly, resources. What resources are available? Have we identified them? Have we identified, how accessible they are? All of those things are going to be critical in, drawing up a effective plan. And then it ends with a simple plan that everyone can agree to and can be followed during periods of stress. Because as we mentioned before, if a person doesn't agree with the plan, it's highly unlikely that they're going to implement the plan. Okay. Rules of thumb for safety planning. One, we want to keep it simple, right? Think about it as a what to do win list. We want to consider those things that have worked in the past, right? Let's put that at the top of the list. Lastly, well, not lastly, but thirdly, we want to also identify things that have made the situation worse, right? Not necessarily so that we can avoid them altogether, but so that we can properly manage them, right? Because if I know what has made the situation worse, I can hopefully, more effectively navigate that and minimize the escalation of the crisis. And two, over time, if I know that this is something or someone that is making the situation worse, hopefully I can work with that person who is experiencing the crisis to overcome and to strengthen themselves around or as it relates to those things that have made the situation worse. All right. I.e., helping them to build resilience towards those things that have made it worse. And then lastly, identifying supports, names, numbers, and when to call. Again, just going back to that conversation about knowing who's responsible for what so that you know who to call for what and when you should be reaching out and calling them. As we dig a little deeper and we start to think about more questions that we can begin to ask as we develop our plan, many of those questions will revolve around the idea of patterns, triggers, things of that nature that have contributed to the crisis getting worse. Why do I want to be able to identify patterns and triggers? Well, if these are things that are commonly coming up and resulting in a person going into crisis, I think I want to know about it. I think I want to make note of it. Because if I can perhaps put things into practice that maybe avoids those things altogether, then I give myself and that person a better chance of overcoming the crisis or reducing the frequency with which those crises events occur. And again, going back to the conversation of being able to plan for it, right? So if I at least know what the patterns and triggers are, I can begin to, develop effective strategies and build resilience so that those patterns and triggers hopefully don't remain patterns and triggers that contribute to the crisis. And then secondly, we are going to ask ourselves questions that focus heavily on outcomes, right? So are the outcomes desired? Are they positive, right? Is a desired outcome always a positive outcome? Not always. It should be, but some people may desire an outcome that is not necessarily positive for all parties at hand, right? So when we start thinking about outcomes, when we start thinking about planning for a crisis, one of the words that we have to consider is compromise, right? Um, Compromise does not have to be a dirty word, but it's part of the process of working towards agreement. For example, if you just think about, a common occurrence between parents and child, right? A parent tells a child to do something or not to do something, and the child ends up doing that thing or not doing that thing, and the parent decides to remove their technology, right? So I take away the phone or tablet or whatever technology they have access to. That ends up becoming the consequence or the punishment for not doing what was asked or doing something that you were told not to do. Well, in that circumstance, the child simply wants to get their device back, right? And then the parent, on the other hand, simply wants the child to either do what they were told or asked to do or not do what they were told not to do. Um, those two outcomes are not one and the same, right? So somewhere along the line, some kind of compromise may need to be had, right? So maybe from the parent, I decide that I still have an expectation that something gets done, but maybe that task that I wanted to get done, maybe I give them more time to get it done, or maybe I expect them to do half of it, and there may be different reasons why I do that. Maybe I realize that they don't have the capacity to complete said task. And so, I determine that they need some other supports to get it done. And that could be they need more time, or maybe they need somebody to help them out along the way. Um, and so I want to consider those types of things when it comes to the outcome. Um, on the side of the child, I want my device back, but maybe, my compromise is I have to accept the fact that I might not get it back in the time frame that I want it back. So I might not get it back as immediately as I want it back. It may take a little bit of time, but I at least now have the hope that I will get it back. Because in the heat of the moment, I probably have no clue as to when I'm going to get it back. And in my mind, whether it's true or not, I might operate as if I think I'm not going to get that device back, right? So in that example, both parties have to consider some sort of compromise in order for us to reach a place of agreement, or to reach a place of agreement when it comes to the plan that we're putting in place. As we continue to develop that plan, we want to know where those available resources are. So knowing where the local or nearest crisis response center is. As noted, you can take note of the crisis response line here that's on screen, and noting that is the number for Philadelphia County. Other counties may have different numbers specific to them for their crisis hotline. Knowing when it's appropriate to take the child to the crisis response center or the emergency room, right? And we want to, collaborate with team members and whatnot to be clear on when that is appropriate and when it should be necessary. We want to have all information needed by first responders in one place. We may include that information in what's considered a refrigerator sheet, kind of like a one pager that summarizes the necessary information that we might need to go to, be it resources or team members and their roles that we need to tap into or utilize or reach out to during said crisis. And then lastly, knowing when hospitalization, that shouldn't be our first response, right? That's why we have all these layers, right? We have these conversations about how to effectively respond to a crisis. If we find ourselves in a place where our responses are not such that they are helping to de-escalate, we may need to call in a crisis response team and have them come out to assess the situation and maybe help and assist in stabilizing the situation. We may find that once that's done, perhaps we just have to put other resources in place to support in the future. And that person doesn't need to be hospitalized, right? Because when it comes to hospitalization, we should be, limiting that to instances where a person is either a danger to themselves and or others. Some of the things that we would include on that refrigerator sheet are things like common triggers and stressors that we've mentioned before, and some specific steps or strategies to help reduce that or avoid those triggers. Agreements that are made by the client and parents with regard to how to handle escalating the conflict. Again, that's those specific steps that we talked about, right? If I can have those jotted down, if I have those agreements made and jotted down, no one should be surprised, right? Because we're just rehearsing and going back to what we've already established. We're not just coming up with these things on the spot and saying, let's try this or let's do that. No, we've already agreed that this is what we should be doing. And so let's start with that. Again, another reminder, names and phone numbers of treatment members and their availability, right? There's nothing like calling someone and they're not available, right? We all know what it feels like to get sent to the dreaded voicemail. And that would be even worse in the midst of a crisis. It would feel even more difficult and challenging in the midst of a crisis, because in the midst of a crisis, we urgently want whoever we're calling to answer the phone, right? So if we know not only their numbers, but know when they're available, we have a better sense of the likelihood that we'll get a hold of them during the crisis. We want to know current medical issues, medications that are used, right? So that we're making sure that we're using those, but also, interventions or medications that have not worked in the past, right? So that we're not wasting our time using something that is not going to help us in the midst of the crisis and may, in fact, make it worse. All right. Resources that can be used and when they should be used. And then lastly, if this is a plan that's to be utilized or used at school, we want to have a copy of the plan or this refrigerator sheet, if you will, available to the school with some specific instructions for school staff. At the end of the day, though, the secret to crisis management is not good versus bad. It's preventing the bad from getting worse. All right. Any questions or comments?